Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you here. My name's Neil Cox. I'm the head of the Leonard A. Lauder Research Centre for Modern Art. We're a specialist entity in the Met, focused on modern art of the last third of the 19th century through to the 1960s. We host and fund pre-doctoral, postdoctoral, and mid-career scholars. We develop digital resources, run public programs like this one, and partner on study days and workshops in and beyond the Met. Our flagship public film screening program is in its 4th year. Do come along to our short films for short nights with live music on Friday the 10th, 17th, and 24th of July. If you haven't already, feel free to pick up our latest newsletter. On the back, if you have the skills, there are some QR codes which you can use to get quick links to our Instagram and website where you can find out what's happening next. This evening is the 3rd Leonard A. Lauder Annual Distinguished Scholar Lecture, following those given by Richard Powell and Adrian Childs, which you can now re-watch on video via our webpage. Now, it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Frederic J. Schwartz. Fred, as we all know him, is Emeritus Professor in History of Art and Architecture at University College London, one of the most important and intellectually rigorous departments in the UK. A former editor of the prestigious Oxford Art Journal, he's written extensively on 20th century German art, architecture, literature, and critical theory. His books include The Werkbund, Design Theory and Mass Culture Before the First World War, which was in '96, but it's translated into German in 1999, and Blind Spots, Critical Theory and the History of Art in 20th century Germany. His most recent book, The Culture of the Case, Madness, Crime and Justice in Modern German Art, 2023, explores how artists move between media in the construction of cases, borrowing practices from the legal and medical realms to expose and debate political matters repressed in the problematic public sphere of their time. Although Fred pursued most of his career in Britain, which is where I'm from, if you hadn't guessed, he is a native of New York State, completed his PhD at Columbia, and now lives in Sweden. During his residency as distinguished scholar, he's worked intensively on the material that he'll speak about in brief this evening, focusing on extraordinary novelist, playwright, and artist Peter Weiss, and questions of art, language, and exile. Please welcome Fred to the stage.
Thank you, Neil, for the generous introduction. And more importantly, thank you for running such a wonderful research center. It's a real privilege to be here. And my thanks to everyone at the Lauder Center, including Lauren Rosati, the rest of the staff, and the fellows for the warmth of their welcome. And finally, my gratitude to Stephanie D'Alessandro, the Leonard A. Lauder Curator of Modern Art, who many years ago now first raised the possibility of coming to the Met. I'll be talking this evening about the writer Peter Weiss, who was born outside of Berlin in 1916 and grew up in Germany until he was forced into exile in 1934 because of his father's Jewish background, which was, at that point, news to him. After stations in England, Czechoslovakia, and Switzerland, Weiss settled in Sweden, where he lived until his death in 1982, shortly after completing his magnum opus, The Aesthetics of Resistance. Weiss is best known as a dramatist. His plays Marat Sade, The Investigation, Vietnam Discourse, and Trotsky in Exile were among the most widely performed in the 1960s. But Weiss's interests went far beyond the theater. He wrote several novels, worked in the 1950s as a filmmaker, and had originally trained at the Art Academy of Prague as a painter. It's the variety of media and genres that's my topic today, and I'll be arguing that Weiss's background in painting always served as a reference point for Weiss, the writer, and informed his complex and shifting left-wing politics as well. I'll also be considering the languages in which he wrote. Although he achieved world renown as a writer in German, his first literary ambitions were as a writer in Swedish, the language he learned as an adult in his adopted country. Now, it's not my intention to try to revive Weiss's reputation as a painter, though his oeuvre isn't without interest. His early works were, in style and theme, versions of the contemporary new objectivity, the return to a realist and often socially critical mode after expressionism and abstraction. And we can see that in the diptych People in a Streetcar of 1935. That he was ambitious as a painter is clear. Works such as The Machines Attack Humanity of 1935 show his attention to the action of human figures in a shallow landscape, here a prescient scene of urban destruction. In a painting inspired by Bruegel and Bosch, a large cast of characters flees a surreal revolt of inanimate machines. Like the Mannerist painters of the 16th century, he puts significant details at the periphery. There's a self-portrait at an easel in the attic of the burned-out house with a dead, perhaps murdered, female figure in the ground floor. After a year at the Art Academy in Prague, he further explored the valences of post-Cubist figurative painting, ignoring the more modernist concerns of his fellow students. These works show a distanced approach to figures in evacuated urban settings, such as a fine self-portrait of 1938, with a view out the window over train tracks and a shabby building picked out in a startling red by the setting sun. Or in Young Man in a Churchyard, Prague, a rehearsal of romantic motifs, but programmatically drained of their original enchantment. Instead of a resonant nature, a dead outer urban site. Other works, such as Fair at the Edge of a City, bear comparison with complex figurative paintings of the new objectivity, such as Georg Scholz's Small Town by Day, with a sort of fairy tale naturalism rendered strange by collapsing or exaggeration of perspective. Weiss's early work oscillated between a cold gaze and a darkly fantastical vision of modernity. Now, we could follow his development into the 1940s as he tried to adapt to the expectations of the Swedish market for bucolic or folksy motifs, and here's an unfortunate example. But my concern isn't with Weiss as a visual artist, but with the persistent, latent presence of visual media and genres in his written work. Weiss debuted as an author in 1947 with his book of prose poems From Island to Island, published by Bonniers, perhaps the most prestigious press in Sweden. After returning briefly to Berlin in 1947 on a newspaper assignment, Weiss turned his impressions into the book The Vanquished, a dark, surrealist series of sketches from the devastated city, marked by a haunting identification with both victims and perpetrators. And this is a theme of his early work, the guilt-laden grappling with his own survival and his conflicted Germanness. But soon, Weiss's career as an author in Swedish stalled. 2 manuscripts, 1 novella and 1 short novel, had to be published at his own expense. The latter, called The Duel, is a wonderfully surrealist account of an artist's isolation from the world and from his own lover, trapped in an abandoned factory where he wanders around in the warmest clothes he can find there, a leather welder's suit and helmet, and high rubber boots, and referred to as his diver's suit. And we'll encounter this figure again. At a time when Swedish cultural life turned inward after a brief engagement with the continental avant-gardes immediately after the war, there was no market for these opaque, surrealist, or expressionist explorations of human alienation. The work in which he, as he said, reconquered the German language is the so-called micronovel, The Shadow of the Body of the Coachman, written in 1952. It's a fascinating text, a 100-page minute description in 11 long paragraphs of banal and scurrilous events in the narrow space of a country boarding house, beginning with the narrator's closely cropped observations through the half-open door of the outhouse as his bottom gets ever colder. It's been related quite rightly to the French Nouveau Roman, but it also reveals that Weiss continued to be informed by visual concerns. For the sharp eye blandly registering everything before it without regard to sense or narrative, the equal treatment of the animate and the inanimate, and the hallucinatory quality that results are also techniques of artists of the new objectivity. Quote, "Looking up to the house, I saw, as I had suspected, Mr. Schnee standing at his window, his big pale face to the pane like a fish with his flattened nose, his broad pouting lips licking the glass, and the bulging, colorless eyes. Walking by the open window on the ground floor, I had a short look into the family's room. I noticed the father, the mother, the infant, and the son in the following distribution and relation to each other. The mother sitting on the edge of the bed at the back of the room, half in the dark, her breast bared, and the infant at her breast. The father standing at the table in the middle of the room, his fists propped on the tabletop in front of him, the light from the window full on him, outlining the face thrust forward with the mouth wide open. And opposite him, not sitting but squatting on his heels, the son, his chin pressed against the edge of the table, his shoulders pulled up to the ears, staring into the father's open mouth." End quote. Weiss's re-engagement with the German language, and more about its problems later, is worked through by a narrator who makes, as he writes, seeing into an occupation. The detail, the interior settings, and the derisive portrayal of petty bourgeois characters all call to mind some of the painters of the German New Objectivity. I think first, again, of Georg Scholz, here his painting Industrial Peasants of 1920. But the juxtaposition and intersection of media and genres is more complex than that. Weiss turns the move to writing in German into an exercise in visual description, but he avoids the generic convention by which the relation of literature to the visual arts is usually explored, the mode of ekphrasis. Instead, he alludes to another visual genre. Like many painters of the New Objectivity, he sees the world, with all its objects, agents, and actions, as still life. The allegorical resonances and puzzle-like plots of contemporary writers such as Alain Roquerillet are absent. Instead, his path to the word was through the eye, and, just as importantly, that eye sees through the tropes and techniques, indeed the style and tone, of specific forms of painting. Weiss made illustrations for the Coachman as well, collages of late 19th century printed material. He thematizes the sharp cut and discontinuity of the collage process by describing the torn pieces of newspaper supplied in the outhouse. Quote, "As for paper, everyone rips as much as he needs from the torn up newspapers stacked at the corner of the seat. Here, in the outhouse, these remains of newspapers, with most of their information many years old, find a new reader, sitting bent forward. One gets absorbed in small mixed-up fragments of time, in events without beginning or end. often even divided crosswise, up and down. One follows one person's speech and continues with the speech of another. One reads the description of the scene of any action and then glides onto the scene of a different action." End quote. Weiss chose fragments of woodcuts and wood engravings, and the resonance with his text is quite striking. The decontextualized details have a specific effect, focusing on the way the lines hug the local contours of the objects of the world at the expense of context, emotions, perception of others, any totality beyond the mechanical registration of the outside of things. The decontextualization also subordinates the woodcut's optical effects to the effects of surface description, rendering the visual atmosphere tangible but airless. The images retrace the surfaces of the world as precisely as the narrator does in another medium. Weiss expands the still life and the myopic description of the world in two directions. First, in time. In turning actions and actors into surfaces, he generates the textual effects of the hypnotic and the absurd, indeed an uncanny continuum of the organic and the inorganic. And it generates another effect. The narrator becomes an alienated subject witnessing a senseless world, granting the banal the attention due to great works or actions, but finding it utterly vacant. These surrealist effects are generated by an intricate intermedial imbrication of modes. The Shadow of the Body of the Coachman was Weiss's breakthrough as a writer in German, but while written in 1952, it was published only in 1960. In the meantime, he had been writing in both German and Swedish. His last major effort in Swedish is an extraordinary novel manuscript written in late 1956 and early 1957 with the title The Situation. It appeared posthumously in 2000 in German translation and in the original Swedish a year later, after having been rejected by every serious Swedish press in the late 50s. And a translation of the original Swedish into English is one of the things that I've been working on while here at the Lauder Center. This novel, too, deals with issues of medium, but crosses them with issues of politics. And indeed, the novel is significant in that it's an example of Weiss's serious engagement with politics before his more obvious turn to the left in the early 60s, in the wake of Vietnam and other colonial conflicts. The novel follows a series of friends in Stockholm over 36 hours in November 1956, one night and the next day and night. It's an intense and ambitious text, written in an intricate shifting weave of conversation and interior monologue, held together by a phantom narrator whose identity is only revealed at the end. It concerns the possibility of political action in the stuffy Sweden of the 1950s. The title is a reference to Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of the situation, developed in his text For a Theater of Situations, as well as essays collected in the series also called Situation, some appearing in English under the title What is Literature? An edition we know Weiss read. Weiss explores the existential themes of freedom and the situated possibilities and imperatives of political action. In another sort of mannerist move, the threat of war that defines the world situation hovers in the background, with the brief invocation of newspaper headlines about the Cold War, the Hungarian Revolt, and the Suez Crisis, showing that the action takes place between the 23rd and the 25th of November. What's striking here is that Weiss explores the possibility of politics by means of a typology of media and reflections on the avant-garde. At the core of this is the opposition of painter and writer. The painter Leo, obsessed with the mute images generated by the psyche, is presented as ultimately solipsistic and trapped in the mere expression of intransitive signs. and a painting of the time by Weiss that we can see here makes this auto-critique plausible. We see action in an opaque, irrational space and agency as fundamentally isolated. Now here it becomes clear that the book is a roman à clé, with the character based partially on himself, but more obviously on Endre Nemes, a fellow art student in Prague who had also found refuge in Sweden and also a certain degree of success as a painter. In any case, the painter is presented as unable to transcend the self. There are two writers. One, Fanny, a consummate realist who writes about but cannot herself engage with life. And she's based on the writer Friedel Benedict, another German exile in Sweden. Actually, she was Austrian. And the other writer is Paul, a playwright, novelist, painter, and filmmaker, and he's clearly based on Weiss himself as writer. Through the course of the novel, Paul struggles with commitment, both personal and political, with the competing demands of raw expression, aesthetic construction, and the non-art of documentary, with the problem of a bourgeois public, and with the demons of his bourgeois past. Following the logic of the situation, both of the writers come to understand the limits of their media and social roles, and obtain a clear view of their field of possibilities and the imperative, from one's own presuppositions, of taking a clear political decision. Now, this typology is also Sartrean. In What is Literature, Sartre privileges prose. The quest for truth takes place in and by language conceived as a certain kind of instrument, he wrote. The use of language as a tool is opposed to poetry, which is the non-instrumental manipulation of language as material. Weiss substitutes painting for poetry. And indeed, his painter Leo is fully committed to the modernist focus on the materiality of the medium, indeed, more than Weiss himself ever was. But there are other examples that flesh out Weiss's reflections on the situation of the writer in 1956. One character, the German political journalist Victor, is based closely on Weiss's early mentor in Swedish exile, Max Barth, and he represents the connection to the historical avant-gardes of the interwar period, from Dada to modernism in literature, painting, and architecture. And there is a fascinating character named Ossian. He's described as, quote, shabbily elegant, with a finely chiseled, unhealthily pale face, and with a demonic gaze, end quote. He's a multimedia artist who bears more than a passing resemblance to Weiss's friend Øyvind Fahlström. Fahlström, like Weiss, a writer, painter, and filmmaker, was himself an exile of sorts and certainly a nomad. Born to a Norwegian father and Swedish mother in Brazil and raised in Sao Paulo, he was traveling in Sweden when the Second World War broke out and remained, separated from his parents for nearly a decade. And following the traces of Fahlström, who lived in New York from 1961 to 1976, has also occupied me here at the Met. The fictional Ossian's life is devoted to two projects. The first is a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk. Quote, here, all artistic forms of expression were brought together on one plane. Image, movement, sound were all here. There were infinitely many combinations of realistic and fantastical forms, between the effects of words and sounds, between static and dynamic events. Paul remembered Ossian's first experiments when he was still working with reliefs, with mobile, automatically driven compositional elements, with small freestanding screens for running film sequences. Later, he had arrived at the final version, the huge transparent surface where the total image in all of its variations was projected up from behind, end quote. The screen was divided into regions, and one was called, quote, political speculations. All the more important statesmen are represented, and every aspect of their previous actions. These are shown by microfilm projections of everything from the most intimate situations to their most solemn assemblies. Their collaboration with the sciences is also recorded for posterity, including the latest findings in nuclear physics, the manufacture of guided missiles, and the production of bombs. End quote. Now, this is a kind of Faustian vision of what Rosalind Krauss has called the post-medium condition, in which artists range across media with no necessary attachment to any one. The situation in which the ontology of art is no longer grounded in specific materials or techniques. And Ossian's second project is a literary one. Since the age of 8, he has clipped out texts from books, newspapers, and magazines and filed them according to topics. There were binders such as Indoors, Part 1, Room Descriptions. Quote, Paul saw innumerable bits of book pages, newspapers, and other texts, some clipped with the scissors, others torn out, in all different styles, in different languages. He leafed through the pieces of paper, saw glimpses of palaces, factory interiors, poorhouses, nursery schools, morgues, hotel lobbies, brothels, harbor pubs, clubs, indoor swimming pools, reception rooms, kitchens, studios, corridors, stairways. Then Ossian showed him part 2. Here you'll find everything concerning various indoor events. And Paul flicked through various bits of printed paper with descriptions of people going in and out through doors, up and down stairs, how they moved around furniture, how they spoke with each other, handed various things to each other, took things from one another, fought with each other, how they embraced each other. He read about animals, children, sewing machines, gas stoves, and pressure cookers in different rooms, end quote. Similarly, there are binders for on the street, railway stations, traveling, marital strife, pregnancy, death, cloud formations, rocks and crystals, water, exhortations, eating, body types, and body parts in motion. As Ossian explains, quote, everything is already written. There's nothing new. All I need to do is assemble the parts according to my own purposes. I'm planning to achieve the definitive form that will render all other books unnecessary. The point is to create literature that is no longer tied to the author's soul, to the author's free will, no longer burdened with unnecessary associations, end quote. Now, it's important, briefly, to see where this is coming from, as it gives a sense of how the relation between media and politics was being discussed in the specifically Swedish context in which Weiss, over the decades, was also working through these matters. The Gesamtkunstwerk of total access to the contemporary world in all media recalls political forms of theatrical multimedia projects. Specifically, the work of Erwin Piscator and Bertolt Brecht would interweave theater with projections of images, photographs, and newspapers, with documentary film footage, not merely adding media, but allowing new ones to loop back upon the old, like theater, challenging them from inside, as it were. And the extraordinary book to end all books, for all its seemingly 60s post-structuralist critique of the author, has identifiable roots in the context of the 50s. For the project of using artistic media as pure material, divorced from the traditional anchors of authorial subjectivity and originality, the critique of the distinction between artistic and non-artistic uses of the medium comes from the tendencies in concrete music and concrete literature, projects in which Fahlström was deeply involved. He had reviewed Pierre Schaeffer's In Search of a Concrete Music of 1952 in the year of its appearance, a book that describes the French musician's experiments with making music by splicing together tape fragments, reversing and otherwise manipulating the sounds of the world around him. And in 1953, Fahlström issued his own manifesto of concrete poetry, in which he proposed what he called the kneading or embracing or hugging or caressing of words. Words, their materiality as sound and visible text, and then going on to explore the semantic resonances of these manipulations. The figure of Ossian shows not only an exciting picture of Fahlström's early project, but also Weiss's deep involvement in the Swedish and international neo-avant-garde of the 1950s. But more on that later. Back to the situation, and two last points concerning its narrative structure. First, the structure is spatial rather than temporal. Everything, the encounters, conflicts, realizations, unions, everything happens in a single day. The narrative strands are simultaneous and expand the extraordinary density of a single extended moment in time. Weiss has constructed here, self-consciously, I think, what Gotthold Ephraim Lessing calls in his essay Laocoon on the relative merits of art and poetry of 1766, the pregnant moment. It is the pregnant moment when a full narrative, its history and consequences, as well as the intricacies of an event, can be grasped, for example, in a history painting. And second, consider the issue of the narrator, whose position or identity is obscure, but, over the course of the novel, increasingly urgent. In the last pages, we learn that the novel represents a text written by Fanny, though this is through the device of Fanny identifying with and assuming the voice of another figure, who is Paul, or, roughly, Weiss himself. The book is a book about the writing of the book, about a painter and filmmaker who decides to be a writer and might write such a novel. Here we see again what we recognize from The Coachman, that a story must always be a meta-story, a novel, a meta-novel, a novel about the writing of itself, something that returns in the aesthetics of resistance, and for that matter, in Marat Sade. And in both cases, the text is formed around and against the pressure of concerns and models that were fundamentally visual and art historical. Indeed, when Weiss gave his acceptance speech for Hamburg's Lessing Prize in 1965, he didn't miss the opportunity to echo and extend one of the classic works considering the areas of competence of painting versus poetry, precisely Lessing's Laocoon, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry. Weiss titled his own speech, Laocoon, on the limits of language. This complex text crosses Lessing's argument that the visual arts can only represent bodies and allude to events, while literature can only recount sequential actions and allude to bodies, with a Sartrean politics of media and his own reflections on language and exile. Like Lessing's, Weiss's argument is built around the Laocoon group in the Vatican. He points to how Laocoon and his younger son on the left look inward, focusing on their pain. Their mouths are open only in expression of their predicament. The older son on the right, however, registers the world around him with his eyes, opens his mouth to speak, raises his hand to point to events. The older son communicates. He engages with the world, and he will survive. This, Weiss says, shows his own situation. He describes the gradual loss of his mother tongue as it was taken over by fascism, as its words were twisted and turned against him, closing him out of the linguistic community that was the home of his thoughts. In Sweden, he says, he gradually learned the new language, struggled to make it a workable tool of everyday life in exile, while accepting the loss of a language that resonated with his inner world, the mythical oneness with language. Banished from language, he retreated into the image, becoming a painter who could, at best, express a pre-linguistic and therefore solely personal truth. But as Sartre wrote, only words used instrumentally could intervene in the world. Only in language could questions and answers, and then new questions, be formed. And this he could do best and reach the broadest audience in his mother tongue. In a way, he describes a sort of dialectical sublation, from the idyllic relation to German to an alienated instrumental relation to the new language, Swedish, and finally to a new communicative, active, and therefore political relation to his own language. It's quite a performance, taking up in gratitude the figure in whose name he was being honored, and extending his thoughts into a new Paragone, or battle of the arts, for the 20th century. And in good Sartrean fashion, he uses the opportunity to define his own situation. His return to the German language, his so-called reconquest of it, establishes a privileged relation to it. By positioning himself outside a mythical oneness with language, and a language that had itself fallen prey to myth, he claims his own relation to it as unperverted and ideologically clean. His relation to German was disenchanted but authoritative. Now, it might all sound a little bit too pat, but in the context of the long-running debates about the politics of exile versus inner immigration, and these post-war debates were brutal, he asserted the new possibility of the German language as a tool of action and knowledge. But it's in his last major work, the three-part Aesthetics of Resistance, that the visual arts are most intimately integrated into the fabric of the text. It's impossible to do justice to this extraordinary book in a brief talk, but I'd like to make just a few comments. The book follows a nameless first-person narrator who's born in Germany, lives in Bremen and Berlin, experiences exile in Czechoslovakia and Sweden. In other words, whose life constantly intersects with Weiss's own. The protagonist, however, is working class and not middle class, and the approximately 8 years covered by the novel trace his moves through the stations of Berlin under National Socialism, Warnsdorf in Bohemia, Civil War Spain, precarious and illegal demobilization in Paris, and underground work for the Comintern in Stockholm. And this is not Peter Weiss's own story. The main strand of the book concerns the narrator's engagement with politics and his path to becoming a writer. But very little actually happens to the narrator. The book is devoted instead to discussions of aesthetic issues and extended, and indeed repeated, meditations on works of art, primarily visual art, and indeed mostly painting. And thus, Weiss raises the issue of genre from the very beginning. Is it a novel, as the title proclaims, or is it a treatise on the politics of aesthetics? Strangely, for a book about paintings and sculpture, the novel is notorious for confronting the reader with 89 dense, imposing blocks of text, often 10 pages long or more, undivided into paragraphs. Gunilla Palmfuerna Weiss, the author's widow, suggested that they might be considered in the light of the minimalist sculpture of Donald Judd, shown in the 1960s at Stockholm's Moderna Museet. But perhaps another work of the era might be a better comparison. Theodor Adorno's Aesthetic Theory, posthumously published in 1970, typographically very similar and just as aesthetic. Comparison with Adorno also gives a sense of the ambition and complexity of the novel, so clearly positioned between the genres of literary novel and philosophical treatise. And, as ever, Weiss has produced a meta-novel. The last section looks both forward and back, a complex future subjunctive retrospect as the narrator anticipates writing the book that Weiss has written, yet another book which is the fiction of its own intermedial origin. The text itself is an intricate montage constructed of heterogeneous elements. Not only the individual blocks, but also the sentences themselves contain radical shifts in perspective, temporality, and space. But the breaks are smoothed over by means of indirect and experienced speech. All are assimilated to a single narrative voice, largely a single subject striving constantly to establish connections between and knowledge of works of art. Weiss develops his aesthetics of resistance by approaching and reapproaching artworks, treating them as stores of knowledge about history and guidance in the practical matters of underground resistance. The book opens in Berlin's Pergamon Museum on the 22nd of September, 1937, with three friends, the fictional narrator and two fellow members of an anti-fascist resistance cell, discussing the altar's friezes. And these two friends are, in fact, based on real historical people. It's the outer frieze showing the Gigantomachy, or battle between the Olympian gods and the giants of Earth, excavated by the German engineer Karl Humann and sent to Berlin over the 1880s and 1890s. Weiss's account of the mythological program, the use to which the altar was put by the rulers of Pergamon, the construction of the altar, and the history of the city is precise and detailed. The problematic governing the account is that of domination, political power, and oppression, but also of the potentially liberating, revolutionary cognitive value of the work to later generations as a cultural legacy. And he's particularly interested in the situation of the artists between oppressors and oppressed. After the Pergamon passages, it's perhaps the prominent and recurring discussions of Theodore Géricault's Raft of the Medusa that are most impressive. They examine the picture from reproduction and then before the object at the Louvre, and include extensive study of the historical accounts on which it was based, the artist's various sketches, his work procedure, and his biography, informed by visits to the sites where the artist worked and finally died. Here, the emphasis is on the intertwining of political statement and the phenomenology and representation of suffering. The Pergamon altar figures in extended discussions of the narrator and the resistance members. These discussions lead to action and, ultimately, death. The Géricault passages are the thoughts of the narrator in various states of isolation, and they lead to writing. And in good Sartrean fashion, the work of interpreting the works is always presented as fundamentally situational. The protagonists are aware that they are interpreting the works for their own use, from their own positions. This leads to the extensive investigation of contexts, of the contexts in which the works of art were created and used. In other words, it leads to art historiography. The purposes were cognitive. The word knowledge, erkennen and or Erkenntnis, are part of the basso continuo of the novel. But this was in no way an end in itself. The point was knowledge not of the past, but of the present, the interpreter's moment. In an oft-quoted passage about art seen from the perspective of proletarian experience, Weiss writes, quote, "It was no longer necessary for us to understand the works the way they might have been meant hundreds of years ago, but rather that they could be placed into our own time, take on life here, for this is what made these works lasting, that they demanded our own answers," end quote. Artworks understood in their historical situation serve as stores of knowledge and experience, but need to be interpreted constantly from ever-shifting standpoints to allow for proper action in the present. Quote, "according to our own measure," end quote. These are the words, repeated often, that characterize interpretation for Weiss, an inversion of the traditional scholarly historicism that seeks to neutralize the values and perspective of the interpreter and to understand events only in their original context. Quote, "works like those from Pergamon," says the narrator's friend Heilmann, "have to be interpreted again and again until things turn upside down and the earthborn awake from darkness and slavery and show themselves as they really are," end quote. And here many people will recognize resonances of the work of Walter Benjamin, an influence that Weiss himself denied. The book, in any case, suspends the aesthetic, the world of fantasy, the work of fantasy, the knowledge of history, and the situated action of the present in the same expansive space. Now, the sheer number of works of art discussed is almost bewildering, from Dürer, Giotto, and Bruegel to Goya, Courbet, and Meissonier. But it's noteworthy, and this leads to my final reflections, that pride of place goes to what we call history paintings. Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, of course, David's Marat and Tennis Court Oath, and Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. And he's also particularly interested in more modern attempts to engage with the genre. Adolf Menzel's Iron Rolling Mill, Robert Köhler's recently rediscovered The Strike, and central to the sections on the Spanish Civil War, Picasso's Guernica. Indeed, the aesthetics of resistance, so notoriously hard to place in literary terms, can be seen in a way as a grand historical tableau of this most ambitious of painting genres. History paintings are defined not by style, but by subject matter, a narrative or historia from classical mythology, the Bible, works of literature, or events of historical importance. And they are meant to provide reminders or interpretations of scenes with larger moral significance. In the history of Western art, they stand at the height of the hierarchy of genres due to the complexity of mastering multiple figures combined with narrative in the service of the greatest intellectual and emotional effect on the viewer. For a painter engaged in writing, the genre provides a model for negotiating precisely the political debates over literature at the time, in Georg Lukács's terms, the relation of narration and description. At the time of writing The Aesthetics of Resistance, Weiss was preoccupied by just such issues of mediality and narrative. And here is a typical entry from his notebooks. Do visual artists tend towards the static, the meditative, and writers toward the dynamic? The dichotomy, the grasping of a single closed situation and the pursuit of mutability in a process. The immutable opposed to development. What in writing is the successive is in the image simultaneity. Can the course of an event be represented in a picture as in writing? Yes, for example, Bruegel, The Stations of the Cross. Different stages on the same plane. Epic pictures. And here's the painting that he was referring to, where we see simultaneously Christ collapsing under the weight of the cross at the center, the preparation of the crosses at Golgotha at the upper right, and the fainting Virgin assisted by St. John and Mary Magdalene at the lower part toward the right. Now, the reflections themselves represent commonplaces, but the point is that Weiss has produced in The Aesthetics of Resistance precisely such an epic picture. The model of history painting also helps explain the texture of the work. Weiss is engaged in a complex weaving of historical fact with empathic recreation, narrative with isolated and episodic detail, ranging over the space of the entire Western tradition of art and literature. These are, of course, part of the historical novel, and Weiss's work is also that. But Weiss undermines the sweeping, forward-moving temporality of this genre, compressing history, and indeed the Western tradition, into seemingly endlessly extended moments, moments seen from a distance. His use of smoothed-over montage is analogous to the complex layering of historical detail, separate moments of an intricately ramified narrative and iconography of a history painting. For despite the commonplace of the painting representing a single pregnant moment, painters of the Western tradition, like Weiss, have known that the temporality of the history painting is far more complex. History paintings simultaneously condense and expand time by combining narrative and description. They might telescope events, showing not only action, but indications of both its causes and consequences. They show various emotions that could be simultaneous or successive. They refer to narrative outside an image and put in non-simultaneous information necessary to read the moment. Such a compression of viewpoints and moments, rendered seamlessly as if on a single stage, is analogous both to Weiss's static tableau of narrative and analysis and to his ironed-out technique of montage. In the aesthetics of resistance, the epic material and treatment of the narrative is potentiated by the epic task of negotiating artistic media and genres in an extended and productively ambivalent paragone, a novel that has internalized painting and presents itself as an aesthetics. So Weiss takes on the whole Western tradition of art, and that's kind of mad, but makes a certain sort of sense. Weiss was born in 1916. The Aesthetics of Resistance gives an answer to the question of media and politics posed by radical artists, themselves in exile, in the 1930s, when Weiss himself was in his 20s. And that question was, what to do with the legacy of Western art and its traditional media, and also whether there was any political value left there for progressive politics. His answer was an emphatic, 3-volume, 1,000-page yes. The political value of the works discussed was always far from clear, but worth teasing out in every shifting constellation. This exploration of the politics of art across its various media was not, however, a sign of the so-called post-medial condition, for the media, on their own terms, mattered deeply to Weiss, and they always helped him define his situation in that expansive political sense that Sartre gave the term. But it's intriguing how closely he hewed to his younger doppelganger, the writer and visual artist Eyvind Falström, born 12 years after him and the model for Ossian in his novel, The Situation. Falström can be seen to inhabit a later cultural world, one characterized by the post-medial condition we know today. If Weiss used his media instrumentally in support of a politics exterior to them, Falström explored how meetings were generated, how they were pieces in a game with rules, how politics was never external to the artistic material, but internal to it. Falström's object was what Roland Barthes called écriture, the politics of language, of signs as material, the politics internal to cultural performance. It's a reversal of Sartre's politics that Barthes worked through in his writings of the early 1950s, and which Falström, who lived for periods in Paris and was intimately familiar with its cultural scene, almost certainly knew. Falström addressed precisely this in his exploration of the consumer market as a complex cultural field, in his presentation of the international economy through the language of pop, in his translation of contemporary politics, such as the Vietnam War or the covert operations of the CIA, into board games. The character Ossian, the demonic multimedia artist of The Situation, is an early and admiring, but not uncritical monument to Falström, who died in 1976. It's an homage to a friend whose path Weiss rejected in favor of a more traditional, modern form of politics, but whose work helped Weiss sharpen his own tools. It's fitting that Falström left his own monument to Weiss. He's hard to recognize because he appears in post-medial garb, in a neo-avant-garde performance piece of a kind that Weiss rejected. It was, in fact, Falström's best approximation of the fictional Ossian's total work of art, a performance of 1966 called Kisses Sweeter Than Wine. Part of the legendary 9 Evenings series in New York, organized by Robert Rauschenberg, it involved live actors, 3 screens showing photographs, film, and television projection, an elaborate set from which a space woman descended with a papier-mâché head of Lyndon Johnson, and more. It's a delirious but scathingly critical account of American society, and Falström lived in New York from 1961, and of its politics and its war in Vietnam. And it begins with Weiss, in the form in which he presented himself in the 1953 Swedish novel, The Duel, at a time when Weiss and Falström were collaborating closely in the Stockholm University Film Workshop. Weiss presented himself as an artist locked to the annoyance of his family and friends in a diving suit, his figure for the artist isolated from life. Mysteriously, no doubt, to all but a few, Kisses Sweeter Than Wine begins with the ritual sacrifice of the so-called frogman in a diving suit. The frogman was caught in his media, isolated by them, and had to be eliminated for the media to open up and display their plenitude, with all their dangers, but also their new room for maneuver. It is a fitting homage to a first Swedish and then international avant-garde, both at the tipping point between modernism and something else that was the shared ground of Weiss's and Fahlström's very different work. Thank you.